If you're familiar with the channel, my stance vis-a-vis the Jackson adaptation of LOTR is, well, probably not the consensus one, where apparently the consensus is these are the greatest things in the universe. And overwhelmingly, we all agree to this. We all know this to be true. They are flawless gems. There can be no legitimate flaws in these films, apparently. If you do think there are legitimate flaws, of course, you're, looking at them carefully, but we're not going to do that. Well, I'm not going to discuss my own interpretation of LTR, the adaptation. That will take probably hours and hours to work through, apparently for people who are a little sick-headed. But here we're going to be looking at once upon a time when, LOTR was not considered the greatest, most beautiful thing in the universe. And surprise, surprise, I'm actually going to be defending Peter Jackson in a few places. So we're going to hear Richard Roeper, who replaced Gene Siskel on Ebert and Siskel, when tragically Gene Siskel died. And he's going to have some curious things to say about the first installment of the Jackson epic trilogy.
Lord of the Rings. It's an impressive achievement, but I am a little melancholy that the movie is a violent action picture and the books by Tolkien come from a kinder and gentler time. But Richard, at a time when Hollywood has such small visions, the purity, the ambition, the scope, the vastness of this film, those guards protecting the way down that river passage.
I agree. All of that is impressive.
Well done.
Hey, they spent a ton of money on this movie, and you can see the money on the screen.
Yeah.
It looks great, and the little people don't look like they're superimposed against the regular-sized people, and the giants look like giants, and all that good stuff. But Roger, it goes on forever.
Okay, well,
and I understand that movies, Harry Potter is part of a series, but it ends on a satisfactory note.
Okay.
He did not like Fellowship. Apparently he thought Fellowship was kind of weak and gave it the famous downvote or thumbs down, which they did back then, though the system keeps changing with critics in terms of how they do things. Ebert was much more enthusiastic, but interestingly enough, he was more negative towards Two Towers. So he actually defended Jackson early on as trying to do justice to Tolkien, and he actually seems familiar with the books, whereas Roeper, to put it mildly, exposed himself as kinda not too knowledgeable on Lord of the Rings. But he did actually praise Two Towers. But like Fellowship, he didn't do so on proper ground.
He is drawn to the feisty Eowyn.
The women of this country learned long ago. Those without swords can still die upon them. I fear neither death nor pain.
What do you fear, my lady?
But even with the sprinkles of romance and light humor, The Two Towers does have an overall tone that's darker and more violent than the first leg of the trilogy. The action sequences are on a par with such historic spectacles as Ben-Hur and Gladiator, and the special effects are vastly superior to those two films. This film doesn't change my review of the original, but it does have me eagerly looking forward to the final installment. I liked it a lot.
So you're finally thumbs up for
Absolutely.
LOTR. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, I've been raked through the coals on this issue a few times myself when it comes to using names of fantasy worlds, whether Dune or Wheel of Time, and so on and so forth. So I'm probably going to get zapped no matter what I do, which I think is proper, because even though Jordan, as well as other people, do spell out the pronunciation, and Tolkien technically did, right, because he laid out the languages, I think with fantasy names, it's a little bit difficult. Some people are going to say Harkonnen, some people are going to say Harkonnen. You just got to live with differences of opinion on these pronunciations, and just be careful and just be moderate in the way you approach it. But I think the proper pronunciation is Eowyn. It's Eowyn, whereas he went with a different pronunciation. But he admits this, that he is sort of a novice to the books. Again, he's still full of praise, but he does admit he doesn't quite know what he's talking about.
Considerable epic in movie history, and it really does work in the long scale. I'm looking forward to the third part too. What I want to know is, would it have been possible to be true to the spirit of Tolkien and still make movies of this cost and length and spectacle, or was it necessary to really tilt toward violence and action in order to get the audience?
Well, there are lots of people out there who know more about Tolkien than I do, but...
Are you fucking kidding me?
Well, there are lots of people out there who know more about Tolkien than I do, but I do believe that it is true to the spirit. The characters are true to the first film, and yeah.
Kind of interesting, and where I fall in all this. So he faults Fellowship for having too many characters and being too long, and the pacing is off. To put it mildly, that's really hard to justify even as criticism because Jackson cut out an insane number of characters. There are just many characters who never appear in any of the movies, even the extended editions. From what I'm aware of, canonically, Tom Bombadil does not exist in the Jackson universe. That's a pretty big absence. He also does a lot of things to the characters, like radically change them. Aragorn simply does not act like that in the books. He doesn't say those things. He doesn't mean those things. He doesn't even look like he does in the books. Ebert, as always, is a little bit stronger here. That, yeah, they radically transformed the books into much more action-filled, epic adventure stories, which partly is what is in the books, but they really destroyed the whole intention because that really wasn't the point. He wasn't trying to write like these thrillers. That wasn't the point of the books. The books are meant to be rather interesting attempt at fantasy, integrating philosophy, theology, and myth making, but in some interesting new ways for the time period. So I agree with Ebert more than Roeper here that, yeah, you can enjoy these as interesting action films, but presumably they are meant to be Lord of the Rings, and on that scale, they do really betray the source material and just depart from what Tolkien intended in either moderate or radical ways. But they do have a lot of enjoyable moments. I do find it funny how Roper is trying to hang on to, I'm not saying Fellowship is good now, but they did a good setup, there's a good payoff, blah, 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 blah. But you just said in Fellowship there are too many characters. So which is it? Too many characters, too few characters? What do you think is a good film? Doesn't really specify. He's just doing the bandwagon. So he was caught in the cold because a lot of people who didn't like Lord of the Rings or never did or don't understand the fantasy made fun of Fellowship for being stupid. But then when it became overwhelmingly popular, he just flipped like a flapjack and now says, oh my God, these are really great. I expect the third chapter to be amazing. Roger, yes, it's a moment in movie history and yeah. At least I respected him when he didn't go with the grain. It's like, okay, there are reasons to not like Fellowship or not recommend it and saying, yeah, it's kind of overrated nonsense. But he didn't give legitimate criticism. He gave really, really weak criticism. But he thought, well, it's safe. I mean, who takes these things seriously? Lord of the Rings. Fairies, hobos, and a bunch of weirdo trees talking. Who the hell is going to care about this junk in a couple of years? So he basically just used very strong cultural prejudices to say Jackson made bad films. But being more even-handed, he made, I think you could call them good films, but you have to make a lot of qualifications. And certainly if you do know Lord of the Rings, as I do as an expert level, you're like, we can say there are many things, but to say that they're faithful to either the spirit or the word of the text is really ridiculous. That's just simply not true. But that is the mythology that the, quote, new and old fans want to embrace. Why? Whether for racism or stupidity or nostalgia, or they need something to hang on to. I don't know, but these books are not being portrayed well in these films. Whatever else is being portrayed in these films, it's not the Lord of the Rings story. It's another story. You may like that story, you may prefer that story, but it's not Tolkien's story.
Actually superior to those two films. This film doesn't change my review of the original, but it does have me eagerly looking forward to the final installment. I liked it a lot.
So you're finally thumbs up for
Absolutely.
LOTR. Okay.
Absolutely.
You know, I looked at the...
I find your lack of faith disturbing.